My baby dolls, we're here again on another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and the man with the plan, the co-pilot, the co-captain, Marc Weiss, is running a little behind. He'll be joining the show, and today we got another great show in store for you folks at home. We are dealing with one of my favorite topics, the Negro Leagues, and of course, I had Leslie Hefty on my show last week, who wrote probably what I consider the definitive overview for anyone who starts to get interested in the Negro Leagues, called plainly the Negro Leagues, 1869 to 1960. That show was published the other day, so go look that up if you want to know more. But today we are going to be geographically zoned into Minnesota, and we're going to get to the book. We'll get to our special guest, the author, Frank White, but you are listening to my show, Genesis, on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with Ralph Tycho, the Zigzag Man, and I invite all of you to go to this site, the ComfortablyZonedRadioNetwork.com, and there's a whole lot of good shows on it. I'm usually with Alan Blumkin and David Nemec on Old Time Baseball. We've been doing a few segments now from the late 1890s. We're in the mid-1930s now. Those who are interested in that time period, you're going to get both Major League Baseball and, of course, the Negro Leagues, because the Negro Leagues are so dear to my heart. But today we're focusing on Minnesota, and what a book. This book was published, I believe, last February, 2016. They Played for the Love of the Game. Untold Stories of Black Baseball in Minnesota. And, you know, when we talk about the Negro Leagues and when we speak about, the baseball, you think of Kansas City and Pittsburgh, and of course, the Negro Leagues were pretty much a Midwestern thing, but unfortunately, St. Paul and Minneapolis was left out by Rube Foster when he created the league in 1920. But this fine, well-researched book by author Frank White, whose foreword is by Dave Winfield, because Mr. White knows Dave Winfield. And for all of you who don't know Dave Winfield, he was an excellent baseball player. I was 11 years old when it came to my New York Yankees. I was like, wow, we got Reggie Jackson, we got Dave Winfield from the Padres. We're going to win so many World Series. And the Yankees went bust. But I always loved Winfield. I loved what he did for children. I loved the fact that he put Minnesota on the map. And we're going to learn a lot about black baseball in the communities. I think that is my co-captain right now. Is that the man with the plan, Marc Weiss?
Yes, I just parachuted in, and I'm ready to go.
Well, we have, like I've been telling the folks at home, we got Frank White. We got They Played for the Love of the Game. I'm going to do a little synopsis about Frank, and then we can begin the inquiries. How's that sound, Marc?
Absolutely. Let the friendly interrogation begin.
All right. Frank White is a former athlete, coach, official, and sports administrator. He currently coordinates in reviewing baseball in inner cities program for the Minnesota Twins. His exhibit, They Played for the Love of the Game, was developed with Ramsey County Historical Society in 2010. Without further ado, Mr. Frank White, welcome to the show.
Ian and Marc, thank you so much for having me on the show. Honored and love the opportunity to talk black baseball with you.
It's our pleasure. Let me ask you now for my first question, Frank. I read your book, and we'll get into your personal issues with your dad and all this other great stuff that we're going to be talking about. But why was it so hard to write, as you mentioned?
I think, Ian, for me, there's just not a lot of statistics, and you know, when you, for baseball people, everybody wants to know statistics, and there's just not documented history. There are some, one-line, two-line kinds of things about some of the players, but not really full detail. And for me, I had grown up, first of all, playing baseball and loving the game and wanting to be like my father. and never really knew about the Negro Leagues coming through Minnesota. And so when I first saw, was at an exhibit that included my father and about 5 other guys, I was surprised to find out that he was recruited by the Kansas City Monarchs and to play, and he never told me that stuff. So I think part of it, in terms of the difficulty, is just the whole lack of documented history, and I've been fortunate to some of my father's friends that I got to see play as a kid, so I have a great memory, I think, and then I got a chance to do oral interviews with many of these guys. So a lot of the book is based on some written documentation, but also some oral history that just I felt needed to be put in place. A couple of times I stumbled along the way, but received encouragement from my wife and some other friends around the game that said, if you don't do this, all of this information will be lost forever, because all of the guys that played with my father, including my father, have passed away.
And let me ask you this, Frank. In the book, you mentioned that your father was a really good player. People had told you. Why do you think he never really much spoke about it?
I think, first of all, I think all men of my father's age really didn't talk a lot about things, as I've learned along the way, and I think part of it was he was a modest individual. Sometimes when he would play ball, different than him, sometimes I might talk too much playing, and I don't recall him ever. He was just kind of a modest guy and just played. So I really wish I knew when I talked to him. The one comment he made to me is after this exhibit, and another gentleman told me, he said, "Man, when those teams used to come through here, and those Negro League teams used to come through here and play at Lexington Ballpark or Nicola Ballpark, they used to come get your father to play." And I said, "Who?" And he told me. And so afterwards, I asked my dad on the drive home. I said, "Dad," I said, Jim Robinson, he said, "Jim tells me that, man, you used to play with those Negro League teams when they come. How come you never told me?" He said, "Well, it just wasn't important." That's pretty amazing.
That blows my mind.
Yeah. And so I wish I would have taken the time. I mean, I was pretty, I was pretty puzzled by the statement, but that was my father. So, I wish we could have sat down at different times, and every now and then he might tell me a little story, that type of thing, but not a lot. So I really wish he and I had a better answer, other than I think that all men of that era just didn't talk a lot about things.
I agree with you on that. I think that kind of holds true to like men of that era who were in service during World War II. They left, they came back, they did their job, they went back to their regular lives. They didn't think about it as being anything exceptional, even though it was exceptionally exceptional. And they just downplayed things. They didn't need a pat on the shoulder, for what they did. And I think the things that we think are exceptional, because they are, they just thought it was normal. Did you feel the same way?
Oh, absolutely, Mark. I think, and without going into all of it, I think if you look at African Americans that finally got to go and fight and were trusted and would come back, and then it would come back to some of the same junk, the same segregation, the Jim Crow kinds of things, which maybe even fostered some of that not talking, as much, not only about, their experience in fighting every day or to survive, depending upon where they were. I think you're absolutely right. I agree.
I always think back to Jim Crow, which was really, that's a kind name for the extension of making slavery kind of still legal, to be quite honest. So, I mean, I think it's a glorified name, but the one thing that you could say, if you could ever grab anything good out of it, was the brand of ball that the Negro Leagues played, because it wasn't just baseball, because Major League Baseball was baseball. This was baseball plus an entertainment factor. And did those guys ever talk about, the entertainment factor that they brought to the game that you just didn't see in quote unquote regular baseball?
Yeah, somewhat. I think they did. In fact, as a kid, I would when I would travel with my father, I would get to see some of that at some of the ball games. And when the score might get a little bit lopsided or whatever, they might pound around a little bit. They might run the third base when they hit the ball instead of first base, and and the crowd would love it and laugh. But I think that I got to see guys that, and I tell this story all the time. There's a guy named Kenny Christian that batted left-handed. He was actually a switch hitter, but he was really quick, and he played just about every position. But this guy, I tell kids today, when we teach drag bunting from, as a left-hander, we tell people and they hold the bat with two hands. Well, Kenny Christian used to hold the bat with his left hand and drag bunt, and he wasn't successful every time, but I was amazed. And that was the play that came from black baseball. That was the exciting kind of thing, because when he would bunt the ball that in that fashion, you weren't going to throw him out. It just was amazing. Today, if you ever see that, you see guys deal with two hands on the bat, and they're somewhat successful. Kenny could do that with one hand, and that was a part of black baseball.
Let me ask you this question, Frank. We hear about Jim Crow in the South. You even mentioned in your book, Minnesota, of all the places, it would be an unlikely, thing for Jim Crow. Okay, why do you think the Minnesota communities embrace the doctrine of segregation?
Oh, gentlemen, I wish I had a good answer. I think my speculation is that, Minnesota was here in the north, but people came from other places, settled here, and as African Americans came here in the mid 1800s, even I think I mentioned this in the book. Dred Scott was here at Fort Snelling, and we weren't supposed to have slaves here because of the Louisiana Purchase, but we did, and people don't know that. So I think some of that just continued. So here at the fort, a U.S. fort that was here to protect people, still embraced slavery, and I think that just rolled into everyday life where people came here, and I think somewhat people were accepted, but to a limited degree. As I researched, I'm amazed at the stories that I would see. People couldn't stay in hotels. They couldn't eat in restaurants. People discouraged them even coming in the front door. And in fact, in 1942, one of our city council members here in St. Paul, the headline in the black newspaper as he was bidding for his re-election, the comment was, "The Negro needs to know his place. His place isn't with white people, and especially not in your place of business." That was in 1942, 3 years before I was born. So it continued. Not only did it happen in the early 1900s, and when people may have, when they been a little bit more embraced in a positive way, because there were some times where people said our state, our cities here was a great place for African Americans, but then it would turn the 20s, the 30s, and into the 40s, and even into the 50s. As I grew up, I can remember living in the Rondo neighborhood. We didn't travel much. That was my safe place and my safe haven. But I knew you didn't go on to other neighborhoods, and so I don't have the complete answer, but I just think that, again, there were enough people here from other places that resettled that continued to carry and embrace Jim Crow, and maybe in some cases segregation.
Just mind-boggling kind of story, especially where we're at today, to even think about how that was going on well over 100 years after the Civil War was over. It really does blow my mind, you know, and I know it to be true, and anytime I hear it, it still blows my mind again, which tells you just how impactful it is. Now, fast forwarding to the guys who were in the Negro Leagues, when did they start to get the feeling that they were going to get a chance to cross over into the major leagues and get an opportunity to play against guys that they knew that they were their equals, if not better than? Or did, even till the last minute, did they not think of that to be an opportunity that they were ever going to get?
Oh, I think, Mark, that it wasn't. I don't think they really knew. I think they kept hearing promises, and like maybe even if this was on Eon's post, you know, where Papa Bell said they kept saying if we find a player good enough, a black player good enough, we'll sign them. And I think the comment was they lied. So I think all the way up until, you know, even when Jackie Robinson is signed, I think players always had the hope. You know, if you went from the 20s when the Negro Leagues, in a sense, formally started, all the way up to when Jackie signs, and then when he retires, you know, after 10 years, 3 teams are still segregated. So I think all along the way, players had the hopes. You know, Josh Gibson and all of the guys that were in the league that didn't get signed or would get signed later. Ray Dandridge, who came here with the Millers and never would go.
He was some player.
Yeah, DeRocha wouldn't bring him up, but he played in his first year here. He was MVP of the league. He led the league.
Well, didn't they use an excuse and say Dandridge was too old? Because I mean, at that point, the Giants had a lot of black players on their team. They had Monty Irvin, I think Hank Thompson. Obviously, by 51, Willie shows up, and obviously that's a story unto itself. But they used the excuse of being too old, right, for Ray Dandridge, who was a phenomenal player. I think in the minors he was like a 360 hitter.
Exactly, and I mean, when you think about that, I mean, for me, first of all, at that time when he came here to Minneapolis, you know, AAA ball was almost like Major League Baseball is today because there weren't that many Major League teams. And,
True.
And so the ball was excellent. I mean, they were great players. And even if he would have been old, man, you still could have got the guy comes to AAA ball and he's MVP of the American Association. You don't get better than that. And so, okay, he might have been old, but man, he must have had a couple good, still a few more good years in him. And you didn't have to sign him to big time contracts, but me, how do you overlook that? Other than that, you know, the statement is that even though the Giants had some guys and the Dodgers had some guys, you know, there was a quota system. And
I agree.
And I think that's the part that probably is the more realistic thing, is they've already had a couple guys, so they weren't going to bring up too many at one time. Because
I think you nailed it. I think you totally nailed it. There was an unwritten quota system. We have enough guys, you know, and there was some balance that they thought of in their brains, and that's what they wanted to do. Whereas like Ray Dandridge could have been with the Giants, kind of like Sam Jethro was with the Braves, where he had 3 or 4 good years, even though he was quote unquote older, but he still had those good years, and the Giants could have really benefited by that, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. This guy was not only a great hitter, but he was a great third baseman. And, I mean, you know, some people talk about him maybe being one of the great third basemen of all time.
And guess what? The Giants had trouble at third base because they were constantly trying to rotate somebody in there to play that position.
Absolutely. I mean, when you go back and you think about, there's actually no logic to the decision not to bring him up at the time.
Of course, we're judging it with the lens of 2017 and not in the lens of the late 40s, early 50s. And by using the lens that we have today, we know that there's no logic, but we also understand what the undertone was. We get it. I think we totally get it. And at least a guy like Ray Dandridge got into the Hall of Fame. You know, I mean, if there's some solace to it, at least he got into the Hall of Fame and he was recognized for being a phenomenal talent.
Absolutely, and that's a wonderful thing, and thank goodness, and you know, was it 2006 when they put in the last, what they have said to be the last group of people? I can't remember the exact number, 13, 16, whatever it is. Effa Manley goes in. I hope that along the way, you know, that's not true. I hope that's not the last group. I know there's a gentleman here named Peter Gorton who continually is promoting John Donaldson, and if you look at the stats that he has, it's kind of hard to wonder why John Donaldson doesn't have enough stats to be in the Hall of Fame. So let's hope that there are more coming, and they'll change that decision.
And you know, Frank, in reading your book, I didn't even know that the first African American credited with playing baseball, Bud Fowler, came through Minnesota when the Northwestern Leagues expanded. I think he played for Stillwater, Minnesota, but of course the league folded due to money, which would be the pretty much the epitaph throughout the Negro League's history, especially during the Depression. But I don't want to talk about Bud Fowler as much, but I do want to talk about is the importance of Prince Honeycutt in Minnesota for the Negro Leagues there. How important was he?
Unfortunately, Ian and Mark, I don't have a lot. There's just not a lot of documentation on him, but it's significant. First of all, he lived outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which is where the majority of African Americans of his time and even today live, and so that is amazing to me. And as we find different players coming through Minnesota and living, but it had to be significant for him to play and also be like the manager of a integrated baseball team. So to think of that time period, how good he must have been to be accepted into even play at his time. And I wish I had more. So at the time he comes in, it's significant that at least he was being accepted for how good of a player he was. And I think that's some of the beginning. I mean, you know, he would have been after like the St. Paul Colored Gophers and that kind of stuff, but he was accepted as a player, and I think that's significant because in a sense, it begins to have people look at, wow, this guy can play, we need him on the team, and eventually he becomes the manager. So I think all of that's important, significant again to Minnesota baseball.
Let me ask you this, Frank. You know, now we're moving into the 20th century, and again, we got Plessy versus Ferguson and separate but equal and all this other stuff. But there was a team, and even I knew about this before I read the book, but the St. Paul Colored Gophers. And would you like to talk about how they were made and what their impact was on the culture of baseball in the Negro areas of baseball in Minnesota?
Wow, here is the standard for black baseball in Minnesota. This guy, Phil Reed, he has a tavern down in downtown St. Paul because about that time, people are living in African Americans are living in downtown St. Paul as they come either up the river or off the railroads, and so he's got a tavern, a business down there, as several African Americans had businesses in downtown St. Paul, and so he decides, I want to have the fastest, meaning the best, black baseball team in the Northwest, the Midwest, and so he hires Walter Ball, another significant name in black baseball, to go to Chicago and recruit a baseball team. So the 1907 St. Paul Colored Gophers are all guys from Chicago. And that team, their winning percentage was 838. They played everybody.
Wow.
They played the Millers. They played the Saints of the time. They traveled, all over to play. They were an outstanding baseball team, and would stay in existence for 1907 to 1910. In 1911, Bobby Marshall and another gentleman would take over the team. Phil Reed had decided he didn't want to be involved. I think he had just gotten remarried, but that team set the standard. You'll find in history that after the St. Paul Colored Gophers, in a sense, go away, their rival being the Minneapolis Keystones across the river, the name Gophers would always stick around. Somebody was always trying to be the Gophers, into the later into the 20s and even into the 30s. Somebody would try to attach onto that name because the St. Paul Colored Gophers were such a draw wherever they went. And I believe in the understanding that I have that my father shared with me, those Barnstorm teams and even my father's team, they would split the gate 60-40. So obviously you wanted to win, but they had a tremendous baseball team and a lot of advertisements, and everybody wanted to be the Gophers. So for me, they're the standard of black baseball in Minnesota, and other people would want to be like them, but no black baseball team in Minnesota ever was the St. Paul Colored Gophers.
Now, you talked earlier about stats in the Negro Leagues, and I think the thing that upsets me the most is that there aren't a complete amount of stats for people to really look back on, and I think that actually hurts things. And I understand that because us baseball fans, we're all so stat driven and stuff like that. Do you think that there are a lot of stats that might have been kept somewhere and they're just the documentation's been misfiled, or they could be in somebody's house and sitting in like a shoebox or something that great grandma left and nobody went through? Do you feel that there's a chance that more of this would come out and people can see? Because I just love stats, and just to see, those numbers it really brings things home to people who don't really know the true stories.
Mark, and Ian, I truly believe that there's more documentation somewhere, whether it's in the basement, the attic. I think people have stuff, but they're reluctant to take the time to go through things. I know I have some friends here that keep saying, I know I've got a picture of Roy Campanella at my grandpa's boarding home. I know I've got that picture. I remember it. And every time I see this friend, her and her husband, she says, Frank, I'm going to get to it. I'm going to get to it. And people just, don't take the time or don't know what they're sitting on. To them, it's just a family photo. But I've got to believe that there are, some other documentation, some score sheets. I used to love as a kid keep score. I learned how to keep score. So I used to love anytime I went to a game, keeping score, and my father's games, the Twin City Colored Giants, I would keep score. I would love to do that, or I would sit next to the guy doing it so I could learn. So I believe, Mark, that there is more documentation. I mean, I is very fortunate in the book. You can't read all of them. I go to an event, and this gentleman walks up to me before when my exhibit was touring. He said, "Can I show you something?" I said, "Sure." This guy takes out this scorebook out of a plastic bag. It's the old hard covered scorebook with broadcloth across it, and he opens up the book, and the pages are all tattered. This book was from the 1920s, and he opens up one of the pages, and he points, and there's a name White in the book. And he said, "Is that your father?" And I was like, "Well, when is this from?" And up in the corner, it was like May 29th, 1927.
Wow.
I was like, "Well, that's not my dad, because my dad was born on February 29th, 1928. But the amazing thing is this, afterwards, I said, "Can I talk to you afterwards?" So I go, and I meet this gentleman, it was his father's scorebook. His father had a baseball team in Oxborough, which is in Bloomington, and this is going to be a great finish. So bear with me just a minute. So anyway, he lets me take the book. I go through the book, and there are 7 games where his father's team, Oxborough Hearst, plays either the Uptown Sanitary Shop or a team called Potts Motor Company in one game. Well, this gentleman was his son called him a truck farmer, but he had a lot of land. So anyway, this guy sells his farm to a group of business people in 1955, and they build a stadium, Metropolitan Stadium, for the Minneapolis Millers on that site. And that site then becomes the home of the Twins when they come. So this guy so loved the game that he actually got to be hired to be the assistant groundskeeper. But what a tremendous little...
Which is now a mall.
Yeah, it's now the Mall of America and IKEA. And so I share that whole story. It's interesting about him owning the land, but here, as you were talking, there's more stuff hidden. Here's a book that legitimizes the Uptown Sanitary Shop team, even in further documentation, because some of the games aren't even documented in the black newspapers. And so what a tremendous find. I know there's more stuff like that.
How do we get it?
Yeah.
How do we get it? Because I think that connects a lot of the dots that are missing. I don't think it needs to be done to legitimize anything, because I think everyone gets how legitimate a brand of ball was played. So I think that we've crossed that plateau a long time ago. But it's just to get more of those stats, just so that people can really see just how incredible some of those teams were and those players were. It really brings it into focus.
Absolutely.
And Frank, Mark reaches a good point, because and we'll get to this in about 5 minutes. I want to talk, before we do that, you mentioned the Uptown Sanitary Shop, and like you have here, you got like the Minnehaha Lake Motor Company. You have all these local businesses. I want to get to that in about 5 minutes, about piecing together the identity of the Negro baseball in Minnesota. But even before I get there, you write so lovingly of the Phyllis Wheatley Settlement House. You have to explain the story and its impact here before we get to piecing the identity of these guys together.
There the Phyllis Wheatley Settlement House in Minneapolis, North Minneapolis. In fact, it is still there in a different format, not near what it was with the photo in the book. And then there's another place called Halleck-U Brown, which is a settlement in St. Paul. Both of these places are the anchors for the African-American community in their respective cities. It's the social place. It's the educational place. It's you learn arts, you play sports. There's books to read. The one difference between the two was in Phyllis Wheatley in Minneapolis, there were 18 sleeping rooms on the second floor. And the forethought for the people that built it is amazing to me. But the reason they built these sleeping rooms was that as people traveled through, and if people are familiar with the Negro Green book, that's a whole nother piece. But it's amazing, because as entertainers would come through here at the time, Marian Anderson and the Negro League ball teams, as they would barnstorm through here, they couldn't stay in hotels. So those 18 sleeping rooms would always be filled with travelers that couldn't find accommodations somewhere in downtown Minneapolis. And so not only was it the anchor for the everyday social life, educational, recreational life, the arts life, it was also the forethought to have rooms for people as they travel through, as a safe place and a welcome space for people to live. I can't tell you there was a tremendous rivalry between both of these places on Minneapolis and St. Paul, which exists today, and that's the normal rivalry of any two cities across the river, not only black but also white. But Phyllis Wheatley was the imprint. It was the roots for so many people, and the impact was that without them, I mean, I think there's a lot of people that would tell you their lives may have gone a different way just because they wouldn't have had the opportunities. They wouldn't have been accepted in other similar places in the white community.
Wow.
Wow, that is a wow. I mean, you think about it, and you think about a game, and in a game there's always rivals. But even though they were rivals, they were still a community unto themselves. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think I get that. Now, how important were the local businesses and their clubs really to the community itself? Was that a binding part of the fabric? Not just for entertainment purposes, but on the social front to kind of look out for everyone.
Well, I think the businesses, whether it was Phil Reed's place, in the 1907, 1908 era, he was involved politically. He was a very giving individual. You get into the Uptown Sanitary Shop, it was Owen Howe that owned the Uptown Sanitary Shop. He also owned one of the black newspapers, and or if on the Minneapolis side, there was Kid Mitchell, who had the Keystone Tigers, the rival to the St. Paul Colored Gophers. He owned a hotel. I think all of those individuals, if most of them, again, the businesses were important, first of all, economically, because of who they also hired. I think they all tended to be giving individuals and also supported again, the community in a sense that they gave money to certain things, whether it was Halleck Brown or Phyllis Wheatley to help sponsor things. And the baseball teams then, I think for the most part, as they did that, I think first of all, it was an individuals, whether it was Phil Reed or Owen Howe, part of it was an advertising thing. Part of it was everybody wanted to be in baseball. I mean, you'll find white individuals all over the country, like here in Minnesota, everybody wanted to be in the baseball business and always looking to have that major league club. Obviously, the black teams couldn't get that far, but they wanted to have that black baseball team. I'm sure it was a sense of pride, and this is my team. But I believe that it was also the advertisement piece as teams would go out and play in different places, they were advertising their business. And I think that was significant, again, to the economic impact for those individuals. And also maybe, again, for the community in a sense that people would know that there were black businesses that were owned. There were a lot of black businesses that didn't have ball teams that obviously had the same type of impact.
Let me ask you this, Frank. What was the importance of sports writer Jimmy Lee and his impact, not only for I think he played for the Uptown Sanitary Shop and the Twin City Colored Giants, but what was his impact on reporting on these games and getting this information out to the communities?
Jimmy Lee is a tremendous story. In fact, I have recently identified him as one of the people on the cover of the book. Jimmy Lee was a great athlete. He was really a great golfer, and the newspapers hired him again to do a story on it was called Golf Divots. They wanted him to give tips on golfing. He won in 1939. He won the Negro Open here in Minnesota, which is called now the Bronze Tournament. So he starts off with the golf divots. Shortly they turn in, but for him, he had such a great connection to the community that by writing those pieces, because the major newspapers in Minneapolis and St. Paul sometimes would do some coverage, but if they did, it was minimal at best. But without his documentation, him, a guy named Harry Davis, Jim Griffin, Jimmy Lee is really the anchor and had long term been the guy. Without his documentation, I don't know that I would have had enough to complete a book, because a lot of his stuff, there's articles that guys I never even knew played baseball. There's a guy named Leo Lewis that was an outstanding football player, went up to Canada, played for Bud Grant. I have found like about 3 places where he actually pitched, hit home runs, and played for the Twin City Colored Giants. I think those things by Jimmy Lee, always supporting and honoring those guys that were good at the time, because they just weren't being talked about in the major papers. And I think that's the importance of a Jimmy Lee, as he wrote and always tried. It might only be 2 or 3 lines, but those 2 or 3 lines were at least honoring those individuals for how good they were, and would bring notice again to other things. Jimmy Lee, recently, I've got him inducted into our high school league Hall of Fame. This guy was the first black umpire in the Big Ten. He was a great basketball and football official that, let me give you one example of him in terms of basketball, because here's a great illustration. We used to have 32 district tournaments that pared down to 8 region tournaments, and then each of those teams would have a championship, and there would be an 8-team state tournament in basketball. Jimmy Lee would work in 22 of the 32 district tournaments, about 4 or 5 of the region tournaments, and he never worked the state tournament. This guy was such a great official. And so there's another illustration of it, of the impact in sports, where there was a time here that, you know, even in that type of sports venues, guys weren't getting an opportunity to work. This guy was the stories are just incredible. There's a recreation center now named after him, but he was a great baseball player, and he wrote. So thank goodness for him and what he did. He was very well known in downtown St. Paul. He was an elevator starter at the First National Bank. And when I used to go visit my father, he would always be there, and he would always call me, "Hey, little Pud, what are you doing today?" And I'm going to see my dad. So, but he knew everybody. He knew everybody. So thank goodness for Jimmy Lee.
I tell you, Frank, at this point, I'd like to throw out some social commentary. And I think I was thinking about it. I said to myself, one of the reasons why I think that we're not hearing as many stories, there's not a lot of stats coming out, there's not a lot of push to get people in the Hall of Fame who deserve to be there, is the fact that I feel like Negro League Baseball was at the forefront of the civil rights movement. And then we fast forward and Jackie breaks the color line, and then we start to see a lot of black ball players become real big superstars in baseball. And that's the National League dominated the All-Star game because the National League had most of the black talent, because the American League was very slow and embracing, and they got their clocks cleaned all the time. And you fast forward to today and you see less than 8% of Major League Baseball is African American. And that's a problem in my mind, keeping the Negro League stories alive, because it seems like a lot of the African American population isn't interested in baseball. And I think that'd make Jackie cry, and probably a lot of these guys too, because they fought so hard to make their imprint in this game, and now it seems like you don't see it anymore. But then I turn on the World Baseball Classic, and I see the top 2 pitchers on the American side are Stroman and Archer, 2 African American guys, and I'm thinking there's so much talent that could be here in this baseball game, and it's not. What do you feel about that? And I apologize for being so long-winded too.
Oh no, well, you know, I think you're right. I agree with you in the sense that there is such a potential. I think that the complications is again, just my opinion now, is first of all, even when we go to Jackie, as things began to change, already guys were like my father. My father continued to play, but there were a lot of guys that played with my father that had now turned to other sports. I think as we fast forward to today, man, the NBA and the NFL have gone out and marketed themselves to the world. Now, we talk about the World Baseball Tournament or whatever, and yes, there's that. But I think Major League Baseball has kind of sat back and said, we're America's pastime, but the complication comes in that baseball has become, at the elite level, pretty expensive to play. Mm-hmm. We have some tremendous athletes here in St. Paul, so we have kids involved in baseball in the IBI program, reviving baseball in inner cities. We have kids. As they get older, the sports, it begins to change. Now, I don't know, that's probably the influence at home. I hate to generalize and say that, but I would tell you that right now, a lot of kids play sports because of their connection to family members and friends. And you don't have a lot of people today. I share all the time, if you're in your mid-30s today, okay, and if you're African American, the likelihood of you playing baseball is pretty remote. However, you probably were connected to basketball or football. And I think that's our complication. And I hate to generalize that because I don't want anybody to use that saying, well, Frank said. But I think if you look at it, and then the other complication is,
I think the numbers bear it out, though. I think you're right.
And then as you take kids into high school, we have great kids that play good, very athletic. But by the time they get to high school, now somebody's talking to them and they're a good athlete, and they're saying, I want to go to college and play. In basketball, you can get a full scholarship. Mm-hmm. Football, you can get a full scholarship. If you're going to play Division I or Division II baseball, you look at Division I baseball and you get, I think it's like 11.3 or 11.6 full scholarships to spread over 30 guys. You're at best, you're getting maybe a 50% ride. Nobody's getting a full ride in baseball. So there again is part of the complication. Now, by the time kids get to high school, there's also, right now, I know here in Minnesota and other parts of the country, it's not only Legion Baseball or RBI or Kel Ripken, but you have now these clubs that are the elite clubs where kids are spending $3,000-$5,000 to be on these clubs, to go to showcases all over. And I always tell parents, everybody that's paying that kind of money, first of all, they're not going to get a scholarship. And if they do, it's only going to be a partial. So some parents have the dream and the ability to pay. But how many people are really going to spend that kind of money to advance their kids when there's an opportunity that if you're also a good athlete and you can, let's just say you play basketball and baseball. In all likelihood, you're going to be signing a basketball scholarship.
Let me ask you this, Frank. During World War II, because now we're getting to the point where, the barriers are breaking down. World War II comes, President Roosevelt issues his Order 8802, which is now banning discrimination, and of course, we have the Civil Rights Movement. In Minnesota, regarding both of these issues, both the lessening of discrimination in businesses and the Civil Rights Movement, how prevalent was it in the Twin Cities, in the state actually, and what impact did it have on the local teams in the Negro Leagues in Minnesota?
Well, I think you continue to see the picture of, some people would call it today Minnesota nice, and but I think what you see is the impact of Jim Crow continued through that. Where here, even into the 50s, even into the 60s, there were covenants still of where you could live and where you couldn't. and I know we don't have time. I would love to tell you some stories, but there were places in the Twin Cities that you just couldn't buy. But even though the law said in civil rights you couldn't do that, those things were continued here, as well as other places. The amazing thing to me, gentlemen, is that I grew up, and in school, we always heard the history about those things, or maybe on TV we saw the history of what was happening in the South. Well, it was happening here too, just in another form. And I'm sure if you talk to individuals older than me, they could tell you even more stories. But I think civil rights, while the law was there, the everyday situation in life, there were other challenges, other barriers. I often tell people in Minneapolis, and I didn't know this until one of my friends, there's 42nd Avenue, which is in South Minneapolis, and as you go out of downtown downtown Minneapolis, the streets get higher. So as you go south in Minneapolis, you get to 30th, you get to 42nd. Well, African Americans couldn't live south of 42nd Avenue. And I tell people that, and they're like, what? And I didn't know that either. I mean, it was like the same here. So the covenants, even though they weren't supposed to be there because of civil rights and the housing laws, they were here. And that would continue into the 60s. And so the impact on all of that, the baseball teams, you will find guys, again, as first of all, the baseball teams would begin to change and die out in the 50s. But even in the 40s, it was the same impact because, again, there was denial of opportunities of where you could play, where you could be accepted. You won't find any black players on Legion baseball teams in the 40s, even though there were guys that were extremely good. My father wins the batting title in 1946 in high school. It's still a record today. He hit 600. So how do you tell my dad he can't play on the Legion baseball team? And so I think those things, the civil rights, the laws, all of that stuff, through those time periods were in place, but like in other places, they just weren't enforced. And it was the undercurrent. It was the Minnesota nice. Well, you're okay as long as you're over there.
Very interesting.
Pardon? Go ahead.
Very, very interesting, Frank, that segregation still existed.
Unofficial segregation, which is probably worse than real segregation.
I think so, because as a kid I didn't really know that, but I knew where we lived, and I didn't have any really desire to go anywhere else, so to speak, unless I was traveling with my father and they were going to play ball. But on an everyday basis, we lived in our neighborhood. It was safe. Everybody knew me. I could go do what I wanted to do, and I don't think I missed anything until I got a little bit older and started to realize that, well, what do you mean I can't drive out here? So it was subtle, as you said. It was under the surface, but many people will tell you here that's the Minnesota nice issue.
Well, let me ask you one last question, and then we're going to wrap it up, Frank. What I would like to do, and I spoke to Marc about this, is have you back on the show again so we could do a part 2 on this, because it is very important, and you do have a lot of wonderful stories to tell. Let me ask you this question. When the Minnesota Twins came into being in 1960-61, when they moved from Washington, D.C., did the black communities embrace the Twins?
They did, and they had already embraced the Millers and the Saints because of all of the guys that had played here. So when the Twins came, it was just further. And I think that as we saw the numbers change, what we talked about earlier, I think in the beginning, we had guys. You had Earl Batty, Lenny Green, Julio Becerra, Tony Oliva. So people did embrace the team. But I think as we fast forward I think you'll find that today there aren't as many African Americans embracing the Minnesota Twins. And some people would say, well, maybe that's because of who's on the field and all of that kind of stuff. You know, I work for the club, so I know the ownership, again, is sensitive to diversity. In fact, we're putting up some pictures in the stadium this year, which I'm excited about. But I think the Twins were embraced, and they had been embraced. We've had some great players here, and so those people that continue to be baseball fans, African American, continue to embrace the Twins and the World Series that they were in, that type of thing, the All-Star games. That still happens. It's just, again, like the players, that the numbers that we talked about earlier of the smaller percentage playing the game. We've got a smaller percentage viewing the game just because they're more interested in the other sports.
Let me ask you, Frank, did you have a good time today with me and Mark?
Oh, lovely. Thank you so much, guys. I really, we could talk about this stuff as you guys have already said. We could talk about this all afternoon. We could go have a cup of coffee or whatever, and it would be wonderful just to sit. This is a great topic for me. I love to talk about it. So many great players that people here in Minnesota and across the country from other states just don't know. I appreciate what you guys are doing and sharing this historic perspective on black baseball and the Negro Leagues. It's truly a part of our history that needs to be talked about.
And of course, like I mentioned, Frank, you want to come back? We'll do a part 2 on Minnesota. We'll do it on Minnesota ball. We'll tell a little bit more stories. Would that be good for you also?
No, that would be great. I would love that. I would love that.
I think we have to do a shameless plug though before we hang up the line. We have to tell everyone to go get Frank's book. You can actually find it on the Minnesota site, the historical site, but you can get it on Amazon too. Like if you want it, there's a Kindle edition out there, so you can get it your immediate gratification. You can get it on your Kindle and read it, and not wait for the next show. You can get yourself educated real quick.
That's right, Mark. And Frank, hold the line. I'm going to end the show. This is how I always end the show. Just hold the line. Everyone always ends up hanging up on me. I just think they get mad at me or something.
I think it's me because I drive this train into a wall sometimes.
Folks, believe me, these stories, the Negro Leagues, having Frank White and his wonderful research on Minnesota black ball. Go out, get the book, listen to the show, ask questions. You can find Frank in my group, the Historical League, Negro League Baseball site. Truly an amazing site. I'm glad Frank is there. I'm glad where it's become. This is important topics. This is part of an American history that you don't read in books, but nevertheless it has to be preserved. Remember, every time we hear stories that Frank has told us, you can't read that in any textbook. It comes from people, their families, their experiences, and that is the true primary resource on American history. I'm Ian Kahanowitz, and also with my co-captain, Marc Weiss. We were delighted to have Frank White on the show today, and in the immortal words of Edwin Almero, good night, folks, and good luck. We'll see you next time.